Commander Jake Martinez had seen enough combat zones to last 3 lifetimes. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove through the dusty Texas plains toward the military training facility. At 42, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had led Navy SEALs through the most dangerous missions imaginable. The scars on his forearms told stories of firefights in Afghanistan, while his steady gray eyes reflected years of making life-or-death decisions in split seconds. The invitation to observe joint training exercises between American forces and visiting British Royal Guards had come as a surprise. After 20 years of active duty, Jake was transitioning into a training role, and his superiors thought this international cooperation would be valuable experience. He had worked with British Special Forces before, but the Royal Guard was different. Ceremonial soldiers known more for their colorful uniforms and stoic expressions outside Buckingham Palace than for combat operations. As he pulled into the sprawling military compound, Jake couldn't help but wonder what he would learn from soldiers whose primary duty involved standing motionless for hours while tourists took photographs. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete buildings and training grounds, creating shimmering heat waves that danced across the horizon. Soldiers moved purposefully between structures, their boots creating small clouds of dust with each step. The briefing room was already filled with American officers when Jake arrived. Colonel Sarah Chen, the exercise coordinator, greeted him with a firm handshake. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had earned her rank through exceptional service in military intelligence. Her reputation for running tight operations preceded her, and Jake respected her immediately. "Commander Martinez, glad you could make it," she said, gesturing toward a seat near the front. "We're expecting some interesting exchanges between our forces and the Royal Guard contingent. Their training methods might surprise you." As Jake settled into his chair, he noticed the subtle tension in the room. Other officers seemed curious but skeptical about what ceremonial soldiers could teach hardened American fighters. The cultural divide felt almost palpable. American directness meeting British tradition, modern warfare tactics encountering centuries-old protocols. The doors opened, and 6 members of the Queen's Guard entered in formation. Even in their combat fatigues, instead of their famous red tunics and bearskin hats, they carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. Their leader, a tall man with sergeant stripes, had the same steady composure Jake recognized in elite soldiers worldwide. This wasn't just pageantry. These men had real military training behind their ceremonial duties. What struck Jake most was their complete focus. While American soldiers often displayed their personality through small talk and casual interactions, the British Guards maintained professional distance. They introduced themselves formally, shook hands with measured firmness, and took their positions with mechanical precision. It reminded Jake of his own SEAL training, where discipline became second nature through endless repetition. The first day's exercises took place on the shooting range, where both groups demonstrated their marksmanship skills. Jake watched from the observation tower, noting how the Royal Guards approached their weapons with the same careful attention they probably gave to their ceremonial rifles. Their shooting was methodical, controlled, and remarkably accurate. Each guard fired in the same rhythm, breathed with identical timing, and maintained identical postures. During a break, Jake found himself studying the British sergeant more closely. The man was probably in his early 30s with the kind of calm presence that came from years of military service. His name tag read Davies, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to responsibility. There was something familiar about him, though Jake couldn't place what it was. The afternoon brought combat drills, and Jake was genuinely impressed by what he witnessed. The Royal Guards moved through urban warfare scenarios with surprising skill and coordination. Their ceremonial training had given them an almost supernatural ability to work as a unit, anticipating each other's movements without verbal communication. When one guard cleared a room, his teammates automatically positioned themselves to cover potential threats from multiple angles. Sergeant Davies particularly caught Jake's attention during close-quarters combat demonstrations. The man fought with controlled aggression that spoke of real combat experience, not just training exercises. His movements were economical and effective, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes. Jake found himself wondering where a ceremonial guard would have gained such practical fighting skills. As the day progressed, Jake noticed small details that set Davies apart from his colleagues. While the other guards maintained their formal distance, Davies occasionally allowed brief smiles when American soldiers made jokes or shared stories. His English accent carried hints of working-class origins, different from the more refined speech patterns of his teammates. Most intriguingly, he seemed to recognize American military slang and combat terminology with unusual familiarity. The evening meal provided the first real opportunity for informal interaction between the two groups. Jake sat with several American officers at a long table in the mess hall, watching as cultural barriers slowly began to break down. Stories were shared, techniques compared, and mutual respect developed through common military experiences. The food was typical military fare, hearty but unremarkable, served on metal trays in a room that echoed with dozens of conversations. Davies sat with his fellow guards at a nearby table, but Jake noticed him glancing frequently toward the American conversations. There was something almost wistful in his expression, as if he wanted to join in but felt constrained by protocol or propriety. When one of the American sergeants told a particularly funny story about a training mishap, Jake saw Davies suppress what looked like genuine laughter. Later that evening, Jake walked the perimeter of the compound, a habit he had developed during deployment to help clear his mind and process the day's events. The desert air had cooled considerably, and stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. The sounds of the base, generators humming, distant conversations, equipment being maintained, created a familiar backdrop that felt like home regardless of location. He was surprised to encounter Sergeant Davies near the motor pool, apparently conducting his own evening walk. The British soldier nodded politely but seemed almost startled by the unexpected meeting. For a moment, both men stood in awkward silence, each sizing up the other without obvious reason for extended conversation. "Interesting day," Jake finally said, testing the waters. "Indeed, sir," Davies replied formally, though Jake detected something warmer in his tone. "Your soldiers are quite skilled." Something in the way Davies pronounced certain words nagged at Jake's memory, but he still couldn't identify the source of his growing curiosity about this particular Royal Guard. The second day brought more intensive training scenarios that would test both groups under pressure. Jake arrived early at the command center, where multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras positioned throughout the training area. The exercise would simulate a hostage rescue situation in a mock urban environment, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleys, and civilian actors playing various roles. Colonel Chen briefed both teams together, explaining that they would work in mixed units rather than separate national groups. This decision created visible tension among some participants who were more comfortable with familiar teammates and established communication patterns. Jake understood the reasoning. Real-world operations often required cooperation between different military branches and allied forces, making this kind of cross-training invaluable. The teams were divided randomly, and Jake found himself assigned as an observer to a unit that included Sergeant Davies, along with 2 American Rangers and 1 other Royal Guard. As they prepared their equipment, Jake noticed how Davies automatically took inventory of weapons and supplies with the efficiency of someone who had done it countless times under actual combat conditions, rather than just training scenarios. "You've done this before," Jake observed quietly, watching Davies check his rifle with practiced movements. Davies paused for just a moment before responding. "Training exercises, yes, sir. The Guard requires extensive preparation for all security scenarios we might encounter." It was a diplomatic answer that technically addressed Jake's question without really answering it. Jake had heard similar evasions from Special Forces operators who couldn't discuss classified missions, and his curiosity deepened. Royal Guards certainly received security training for their protective duties, but Davies displayed the kind of muscle memory that came from repeated real-world application under stress. The exercise began with the mixed teams receiving intelligence briefings about the hostage situation. 3 civilian contractors were allegedly being held in a second-floor office building by armed militants. The rescue had to be conducted with minimal collateral damage and maximum stealth to avoid triggering execution of the hostages. Each team would approach from different angles and coordinate their assault through radio communication. Jake positioned himself in the observation tower, where he could watch all teams simultaneously through various camera feeds and direct visual contact. The urban training area sprawled below him like a miniature city, complete with realistic details that made the scenario feel authentic. Smoke machines created atmospheric haze while speakers played ambient city sounds to increase immersion. Davies's team approached their assigned building from the east side, moving through shadows with impressive coordination, despite being strangers to each other just 24 hours earlier. Jake watched through his binoculars as Davies took point, his movement pattern suggesting someone familiar with real urban combat rather than ceremonial drills. The American Rangers followed his lead without question, apparently recognizing superior tactical knowledge when they saw it. As the team reached the building's entrance, Jake noticed something that made him lean forward for a closer look. Davies was using hand signals that weren't standard British military communication. They were American Special Forces signals that Jake himself had used in Iraq and Afghanistan. Where would a Royal Guard have learned those specific gestures? And why would he use them instead of his own military's protocols? The building clearing proceeded with textbook precision. Davies moved through doorways with the fluid efficiency of someone who had cleared countless real buildings under hostile conditions. His weapon handling was flawless, his situational awareness exceptional, and his decision-making process showed the kind of experience that couldn't be gained through training exercises alone. Jake found himself genuinely impressed by the sergeant's tactical skills. What made the performance even more remarkable was how seamlessly Davies integrated with the American soldiers. He anticipated their movements, adapted to their communication style, and coordinated with them as if they had trained together for months. The cultural and military differences that had been so apparent during formal interactions seemed to disappear completely in a combat scenario. Through his headset, Jake could hear the radio chatter between teams as they coordinated their final approach. Davies's voice came through clearly, calling out enemy positions and coordinating movement with professional calm. But something in his radio technique struck Jake as familiar, not just competent, but specifically familiar in a way that nagged at his memory. The hostage rescue culminated in a perfectly executed simultaneous breach from multiple entry points. Davies' team secured the hostages while other teams eliminated the simulated threats, all within the acceptable time parameters and without any civilian casualties. As Jake watched the after-action debriefing, he noticed that Davies seemed more relaxed during the tactical discussion than he had during any previous formal interaction. During the lunch break, Jake decided to approach Davies directly. He found the British sergeant cleaning his rifle with meticulous care, completely absorbed in the maintenance routine that every professional soldier performed religiously. The weapon showed signs of regular use and careful maintenance that suggested it was more than just a training tool. "That was impressive work this morning," Jake said, settling onto a nearby bench. "Thank you, sir," Davies replied without looking up from his rifle. "Your Rangers are excellent soldiers, easy to work with." "You seem to know American tactics pretty well," Jake probed gently. "More than I'd expect from ceremonial training." This time Davies did look up, his eyes meeting Jake's for a long moment. There was something in that gaze, a flash of recognition or memory that was quickly suppressed. "The modern military requires diverse skills, sir. We train for many different scenarios." It was another diplomatic non-answer, but Jake was beginning to recognize a pattern. Davies was being deliberately evasive about his background, which only increased Jake's curiosity. In his experience, soldiers who avoided discussing their training usually had reasons that went beyond normal operational security. The afternoon brought individual skills competitions between American and British personnel, marksmanship contests, physical fitness challenges, and technical knowledge tests created a friendly but competitive atmosphere. Jake watched as Davies consistently performed at levels that matched or exceeded the American Special Forces operators present, which was remarkable considering the Rangers' reputation for exceptional capability. During the marksmanship competition, Jake positioned himself near the firing line where he could observe shooting techniques more closely. Davies's stance, breathing pattern, and trigger control were textbook perfect, but what caught Jake's attention was a small habit the sergeant displayed between shots. He touched his left shoulder briefly, adjusting his position in a way that suggested accommodating an old injury. Jake had seen that exact gesture before, years ago from a wounded operator who had been shot in the shoulder during a mission in Afghanistan. The man had developed the unconscious habit of favoring that side when shooting, even after physical therapy had restored full range of motion. It was the kind of automatic compensation that became ingrained after experiencing traumatic injury in combat situations. As the competition concluded, Jake found himself studying Davies more intently. The sergeant's age, build, and general appearance matched dozens of soldiers Jake had worked with over the years, but there was something specific about him that triggered half-formed memories. The way he moved, certain expressions that crossed, his face, even his posture when at rest. All of it felt familiar in a way that went beyond general military bearing. That evening, Jake sat in his temporary quarters reviewing the day's observations and trying to organize his thoughts. He had 3 weeks of joint exercises ahead, plenty of time to satisfy his curiosity about Sergeant Davies. But something told him that the mystery ran deeper than professional interest. There was a personal connection he couldn't quite identify, buried somewhere in his memory of 20 years of military service and countless faces from dangerous places around the world. The third day brought an unexpected change in schedule. Colonel Chen announced during the morning briefing that both teams would participate in a survival training exercise in the nearby desert terrain. The scenario would test their ability to navigate, find water, and signal for rescue while working in small mixed groups. Equipment would be limited to basic survival gear, with no modern communication devices or GPS systems allowed. Jake was assigned as an observer to shadow Davies's group, which included 1 other Royal Guard and 2 American soldiers. The team would be dropped at a remote location and required to reach an extraction point 15 miles away within 48 hours. The Texas desert presented real challenges: extreme temperature variations, limited water sources, and terrain that could be treacherous for inexperienced hikers. As the helicopter lifted off with Jake's group, he noticed Davies staring out the window with intense concentration. The sergeant was mentally mapping the landscape below, noting landmarks and terrain features with the focused attention of someone who understood the critical importance of navigation in hostile territory. His fellow Royal Guard seemed nervous about the exercise, but Davies displayed the calm confidence of someone who had been in similar situations before. The helicopter set them down in a rocky area surrounded by sparse vegetation and rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. As the aircraft disappeared, leaving them in sudden silence broken only by desert wind, Davies immediately began organizing the group's approach to the challenge. He checked everyone's water supply, inventoried their equipment, and studied the map provided by the training staff. "We need to conserve energy during the day and travel primarily in early morning and evening," Davies explained to his teammates. "The heat will be our biggest enemy, more dangerous than any wildlife we might encounter." Jake was impressed by Davies's natural assumption of leadership despite being outranked by one of the American soldiers. More interesting was the fact that the Americans seemed to accept his authority without question, apparently recognizing superior knowledge when they heard it. Davies's advice about desert survival was detailed and practical, going far beyond what would be taught in basic survival courses. As they began their journey, Jake noticed that Davies automatically took point position and began setting a pace that balanced progress with energy conservation. His route selection showed intimate understanding of desert terrain. He avoided areas that would require excessive climbing, stayed close to features that might provide shade during rest stops, and maintained a bearing that would bring them to their destination by the most efficient path possible. During their first rest break under a cluster of scraggly trees, Jake decided to test his growing suspicions about Davies's background. "You seem pretty comfortable with desert navigation," he observed casually. Davies was checking his compass and studying the map when he answered. "Basic survival training, sir, part of our preparation for various deployment scenarios." "Deployment scenarios?" Jake pressed gently. I thought the Queen's Guard primarily worked in London. For just a moment, Davy's composed expression flickered. It was barely perceptible, but Jake caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the question had touched on something sensitive. Davies recovered quickly, but not before Jake noticed the reaction. Modern security requirements are quite comprehensive. Davies replied diplomatically. We train for many different situations we might encounter while protecting VIPs during travel. It was another carefully crafted non-answer, but Jake was beginning to read between the lines. Davies was clearly avoiding direct discussion of his background, which suggested he had experiences he couldn't or wouldn't discuss openly. The level of evasion was consistent with classified operations or sensitive military assignments that remained protected information. As they continued their desert trek, Jake observed Davies' behavior more closely. The sergeant moved through the landscape with unconscious familiarity, automatically checking for signs of water, identifying edible plants, and recognizing potential shelter locations. His awareness of environmental dangers was exceptional. He spotted a venomous snake that others had missed and identified areas where flash floods might pose risks during rainstorms. When they stopped for lunch, Davies demonstrated fire starting techniques using minimal materials and positioned the group to minimize smoke visibility from aircraft. These were advanced survival skills that went far beyond basic military training. Jake had seen similar expertise among Special Forces operators who had completed escape and evasion courses, but those programs were typically reserved for personnel expected to operate behind enemy lines. The afternoon heat became increasingly oppressive as they continued their journey toward the extraction point. Jake watched how each team member responded to the physical stress of desert travel. The inexperienced soldiers began showing signs of fatigue and mild heat exhaustion, but Davies maintained his steady pace and alert demeanor. More importantly, he kept careful watch on his teammates' condition and adjusted their schedule accordingly. During a rest stop in the shade of a large rock formation, one of the American soldiers became sick from the heat despite everyone's efforts to stay hydrated. Davies immediately took charge of the medical situation, demonstrating first aid skills that were impressively thorough. He knew exactly how to treat heat exhaustion, positioned the patient properly, and monitored vital signs with the confidence of someone who had dealt with similar situations under actual combat conditions. We need to stay here until evening, Davies announced after assessing the sick soldier's condition. He needs time to recover before we continue, and the temperature will be more manageable after sunset. Jake was struck by Davies' willingness to make command decisions despite technically being under American authority for the exercise. His medical knowledge was extensive, his assessment of the tactical situation was sound, and his concern for his teammates' welfare was genuine. These were leadership qualities developed through real-world responsibility, not training scenarios. As evening approached and temperatures began dropping, Davies prepared the group for night movement across the desert. He distributed chemical, light sticks to maintain group cohesion in darkness, briefed everyone on night navigation techniques, and established communication procedures that would keep them together without alerting potential observers to their presence. The level of detailed planning suggested someone accustomed to conducting actual night operations in hostile territory. The night march revealed even more about Davies' capabilities. He navigated by star positions with the skill of someone who had relied on celestial navigation in places where modern equipment wasn't available or advisable. His night vision seemed exceptional, and he moved through the darkness with confidence that kept the entire group's morale high, despite challenging conditions. During a brief rest stop around midnight, Jake found himself walking alongside Davies as they checked the route ahead. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and their breath created small clouds in the crisp air. Stars provided enough light for navigation, but the landscape looked completely different in darkness than it had during daylight hours. You've done a lot of night navigation, Jake observed quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. Davies was silent for a moment before responding. Night movement is an important skill. Darkness provides cover but requires different techniques than daylight travel, especially in hostile territory, Jake added, watching for Davies' reaction. This time the pause was longer, and Jake sensed he was approaching sensitive ground. Davies' body language changed subtly, not quite defensive but clearly more guarded than during their previous conversations. All territory can be considered potentially hostile during training exercises, Davies finally replied. We prepare for various contingencies. Jake decided not to press further for now, but Davies's evasiveness was becoming a pattern that strongly suggested classified military experience beyond ceremonial duties. The question was whether that experience involved operations that Jake might have been connected to during his own SEAL service. They reached the extraction point just before dawn, completing the desert survival exercise with minimal difficulty, thanks largely to Davies' exceptional leadership and navigation skills. As the helicopter arrived to transport them back to base, Jake noticed that Davies seemed almost reluctant to leave the desert environment. He spent extra time scanning the horizon and checking equipment, as if the isolation and challenge of wilderness survival felt more natural than returning to the structured military compound. Back at base, the debriefing session provided Jake with another opportunity to observe Davies in a different context. The sergeant's report was thorough and professional, but he downplayed his own contributions while emphasizing his teammates' performance. When Colonel Chen specifically asked about his desert survival techniques, Davies credited them to standard Royal Guard training rather than discussing where he had actually acquired such advanced skills. After the formal debriefing, Jake lingered in the conference room as the other participants filed out. Davies was gathering his notes and preparing to leave when Jake approached him directly. "I'd like to buy you a beer tonight," Jake said simply. "Off base, away from all the official protocols. Just two soldiers talking." Davies looked up with a surprised expression as if the invitation was unexpected. For a moment, his carefully maintained professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing what looked like genuine appreciation for the gesture mixed with uncertainty about whether he should accept. "That's very kind of you, sir, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate," Davies replied carefully. "The training schedule is quite demanding and we have regulations about fraternization with foreign military personnel." Jake had expected some form of polite decline, but he was determined to break through Davies' defensive barriers. "One beer, Sergeant. Between two professionals who've both been around long enough to recognize real experience when we see it. No official business, no training discussions, just a conversation." Something in Jake's tone must have conveyed his genuine interest, because Davies' expression shifted slightly. The formal mask remained in place, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes that suggested he was tempted by the opportunity for honest conversation. "There's a small pub about 10 miles from base," Davies said finally. "The Dusty Boot. Nothing fancy, but it's neutral territory where we could speak freely." That evening, Jake drove his rental car through the darkening Texas countryside toward Q, the meeting point. The Dusty Boot turned out to be exactly what its name suggested, a working-class establishment that catered to local ranchers and off-duty military personnel from nearby bases. The interior was dimly lit with country music playing softly in the background, and the clientele paid no attention to two more soldiers sharing a drink. Davies had already secured a corner table when Jake arrived, positioned where they could speak privately while maintaining good visibility of the room's entrances and exits. It was an automatic tactical choice that spoke to ingrained security consciousness developed through real-world experience, rather than training scenarios. They ordered beer and spent the first few minutes making small talk about the joint exercises and general observations about cultural differences between American and British military approaches. But Jake could sense Davies gradually relaxing as he realized this was indeed an informal conversation, rather than some form of official interrogation. "You're not really just a ceremonial guard, are you?" Jake finally said, deciding to address the obvious question directly. Davies took a long drink of his beer before responding, his eyes studying Jake's face carefully. "What makes you say that, Commander?" 20 years in the SEALs teaches you to recognize certain things," Jake replied. "The way you move, how you handle weapons, your tactical awareness, survival skills that go way beyond basic training. Plus, you keep avoiding direct questions about your background." "Maybe I'm just well-trained," Davies suggested. But there was less conviction in his voice than during his previous deflections. "Maybe," Jake agreed. "Or maybe you've served in places and situations that you can't discuss openly. I understand classified operations, Sergeant. I've been there myself. Davies was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing his options. Jake could see an internal debate playing out on his face, the desire for honest conversation fighting against military discipline and security protocols that had been drilled into him over years of service. Suppose hypothetically that someone had served with British Special Forces before joining the Queen's Guard, Davies said slowly. And suppose that person had been involved in joint operations with American forces in various theaters. Would that explain what you've been observing? Jake felt a surge of excitement as Davies finally began opening up, even if only in hypothetical terms. It would explain a lot, he confirmed, including why your tactical skills are so advanced and why you seem familiar with American military procedures. And suppose this hypothetical person had been wounded during one of those joint operations and subsequently transferred to ceremonial duties for medical reasons. Davies continued, unconsciously touching his left shoulder. That might explain certain physical habits you may have noticed. The shoulder gesture confirmed Jake's earlier suspicions about Davies carrying an old combat injury. More importantly, it suggested Davies had been wounded during actual combat, operations rather than training accidents, which meant he had genuine battlefield experience with American forces. What theater? Jake asked carefully, sensing he was approaching sensitive information. Davies hesitated again, clearly struggling with security concerns versus his apparent desire to share his experiences with someone who would understand them. Afghanistan, he said finally. Helmand province mostly. Some operations in Kandahar region. Jake's pulse quickened as memories from his own Afghan deployments suddenly became more focused. Helmand and Kandahar had been primary areas of operation for American Special Forces during the height of combat operations. He had personally conducted multiple missions in both regions between 2010 and 2014, often working with British and other Allied Special Forces units. When? Jake pressed gently. 2012 to 2014, Davies replied, and Jake felt a chill of recognition. Those dates exactly matched his own most intensive period of Afghan operations, when he had been leading SEAL teams on high-priority missions throughout southern Afghanistan. I was there too, Jake said quietly, leading SEAL Team 6 operations in the same areas during the same time period. We probably crossed paths without knowing it. Davies's expression changed dramatically at this revelation. The careful professional mask finally dropped completely, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with disbelief. He stared at Jake for a long moment as if trying to reconcile distant memories with the man sitting across from him. SEAL Team 6. Davies repeated slowly. You were running operations out of Camp Bastion and Kandahar Airfield? Among other places, Jake confirmed. We worked with SAS teams, Special Boat Service, and various other Allied units on joint missions. Some of those operations are still classified, but I can tell you we had excellent support from British Special Forces. Davies was nodding slowly, and Jake could see him mentally reviewing old memories and trying to place Jake's face among the hundreds of American operators he had encountered during his deployment. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, but there was still something specific that Jake couldn't quite identify. There was one mission, Davies said hesitantly, where American SEALs provided extraction support for a British team that had been compromised during a reconnaissance operation. We were pinned down for hours before you got us out. Jake's memory suddenly sharpened as Davies' words triggered a specific recollection of a desperate extraction mission that had nearly gone disastrously wrong. The operation had involved rescuing a British Special Forces team that had been surrounded after their position was compromised by local insurgents who had been tracking their movements. Jake's memory crystallized around a specific night in March 2013. His SEAL team had received an emergency extraction request for a British Special Forces reconnaissance unit that had been compromised while gathering intelligence on a high-value target compound in Helmand province. The British team had been surrounded by insurgents and was running low on ammunition when Jake's helicopters arrived to pull them out under heavy fire. March 15, 2013, Jake said slowly, watching Davies' expression change to one of complete recognition. Your team was pinned down in a compound about 20 kilometers northwest of Musakala. You'd been there for 18 hours when we got the call. Davies nodded, his eyes now showing the intensity of someone reliving a life-changing experience. We thought we were done for. The insurgents had us completely surrounded, and we were down to our last magazines. Then we heard the helicopters, coming in fast and low. The memory flooded back to Jake with startling clarity. The extraction had been one of the most dangerous missions of his deployment, flying into a hot landing zone under heavy fire to rescue soldiers he had never met, but who were counting on him to save their lives. The British team had been professional and disciplined even under extreme stress, following evacuation procedures perfectly despite being wounded and exhausted. There were 4 of you, Jake continued, the details becoming clearer. Your team, leader had taken shrapnel in the leg, and you were bleeding from a shoulder wound. You helped carry him to the helicopter while taking fire from multiple positions. That's right, Davies confirmed, unconsciously touching his left shoulder again. I got hit by small arms fire just before you arrived. Thought I was going to bleed out before extraction, but your medic patched me up during the flight back to Bastion. Jake suddenly remembered more details about that specific mission. The wounded British sergeant had impressed everyone with his calm demeanor despite his injury and the chaotic extraction. Even while being treated for his wound, the man had been checking on his teammates and providing intelligence about enemy positions they had observed during their reconnaissance. You had information about a weapons cache, Jake said, the memory becoming more complete. Your intelligence led to a major raid 2 days later that netted significant enemy supplies and several high-value targets. Davies smiled for the first time since Jake had met him, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. We'd been watching that compound for 3 days before they spotted us. Worth the risk even though it nearly got us killed. The conversation continued for another hour, as both men shared memories of that deployment and others that followed. Davies revealed that he had been medically retired from active Special Forces duty after his shoulder injury failed to heal properly, limiting his range of motion for the specialized combat operations his unit required. The Queen's Guard had offered him a way to continue serving while accommodating his physical limitations. The ceremonial duties are important work, Davies explained. Protecting the royal family requires many of the same skills as special operations: situational awareness, threat assessment, coordination with other security services. It's different from combat operations, but it's still meaningful service. Jake understood completely. Many Special Forces operators struggled with the transition to less intense duties after injuries or age made frontline service impossible. Finding ways to continue contributing while accepting physical limitations required psychological adjustment that not everyone managed successfully. As they prepared to leave the pub, Jake realized that solving the mystery of Davies' background had created a new connection between them. They were no longer just professional colleagues from different countries participating in joint training. They were combat veterans who had shared a life-changing experience under the most extreme circumstances possible. Tomorrow's training is going to be different, Jake said as they walked to their vehicles. Now that I know who you really are. Davies paused beside his rental car, considering Jake's words carefully. I hope you understand why I couldn't discuss my background initially. Security protocols, you know. Of course, Jake replied. But now that we've established our connection, maybe we can make these exercises more valuable for everyone involved. Your experience with special operations could really benefit the American soldiers who are here to learn. I'd like that, Davies agreed. It's been frustrating to hold back during tactical discussions when I have relevant experience to share. Colonel Chen knows my background, but she asked me to keep it quiet unless directly relevant to training. Objectives. They shook hands before parting, and Jake felt the firm grip of someone who had proven himself under fire. The mysterious Royal Guard sergeant was no longer an enigma. He was a fellow warrior who had earned Jake's complete respect through shared dangers and mutual sacrifice. Driving back to base, Jake reflected on how the evening's revelations would change the remainder of the joint exercises. Davies' true background would allow him to contribute much more meaningfully to tactical discussions and training scenarios. More personally, Jake had reconnected with someone who represented an important chapter in his own military career. 36. Next morning brought new energy to the training program. Colonel Chen, informed of Jake and Davy's conversation, agreed to modify the exercise structure to take advantage of Davy's special operations experience. Instead of treating him as a ceremonial soldier learning from American techniques, the program would recognize him as an expert practitioner who could share advanced tactics with soldiers from both countries. Davies seemed transformed by the opportunity to openly discuss his combat experience and tactical knowledge. During the morning briefing, he provided detailed analysis of urban warfare techniques that impressed even the most experienced American operators present. His insights were based on real-world application under hostile conditions, giving them weight and credibility that purely academic instruction could never match. The change in group dynamics was immediately apparent. American soldiers who had initially been politely respectful toward the visiting British ceremonial guards now recognized Davies as a peer with valuable expertise. The other Royal Guards also seemed more confident, knowing that their sergeants' acknowledged competence reflected well on their entire unit. Jake watched with satisfaction as Davies took a more active leadership role in tactical exercises. The sergeant's combination of special operations experience and current protective service duties gave him a unique perspective on security operations that benefited everyone involved. He could discuss both aggressive combat techniques and defensive protection strategies from personal experience with both types of missions. During lunch break, Jake found Davies reviewing tactical manuals with several American soldiers who were eager to learn from his experience. The formal barriers that had initially separated the two national groups were dissolving, as professional respect replaced cultural uncertainty. Davies was finally able to be himself rather than maintaining the diplomatic facade that had characterized his earlier interactions. The final week of joint exercises took on a completely different character once Davies's true background was revealed. Colonel Chen restructured the training program to maximize the learning opportunities created by having both American Special Forces and British Special Operations veterans working together. The exercises became more sophisticated, incorporating advanced tactics that drew on both countries' specialized knowledge and experience. Jake found himself working closely with Davies to design scenarios that would challenge both American and British personnel while showcasing different approaches to similar tactical problems. Their collaboration was seamless, built on mutual respect earned through shared combat experience and recognition of each other's professional competence. The artificial barriers created by different uniforms and national allegiances had disappeared completely. During one particularly complex hostage rescue exercise, Davies demonstrated techniques developed by British Special Forces that were unfamiliar to the American soldiers present. His explanation of room-clearing procedures used by the Special Air Service provided valuable alternative approaches that complemented existing American methods. The cross-pollination of tactical knowledge was exactly what joint training exercises were designed to achieve. Jake watched with professional pride as Davies worked with young American soldiers who were hungry to learn from someone with real combat experience. The sergeant's teaching style was patient and thorough, emphasizing principles behind techniques rather than just mechanical procedures. His stories from actual operations provided context that made abstract tactical concepts concrete and memorable. The most significant moment came during a nighttime urban warfare exercise that recreated conditions similar to those both men had faced in Afghanistan. Working together to coordinate multiple teams attacking different objectives, Jake and Davies found themselves communicating with the intuitive understanding that developed between operators who had shared life-threatening situations under combat conditions. Just like old times, Davies commented during a brief pause in the exercise, and Jake knew exactly what he meant. The intense focus, split-second decision-making, and absolute trust in fellow operators created a psychological state that was both exhilarating and addictive for people who had experienced it under real combat conditions. After the exercise concluded successfully, Colonel Chen gathered both groups for a final debriefing session that would evaluate the entire 3-week training program. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with soldiers from both countries expressing appreciation for the opportunity to learn different approaches to common tactical challenges. The cultural exchange had been as valuable as the technical training. Commander Martinez and Sergeant Davies deserve particular recognition, Colonel Chen announced. Their collaboration has elevated this entire program beyond what we originally envisioned. The connection they established has created opportunities for genuine professional development that will benefit both our military services. During the informal celebration that followed the closing ceremony, Jake noticed Davies having animated conversations with American soldiers who were exchanging contact information and discussing possibilities for future collaboration. The transformation from mysterious ceremonial guard to respected special operations veteran was complete, and Davies seemed genuinely happy to be acknowledged for his real contributions to military service. As the evening wound down, Jake and Davies found themselves on the base's observation deck, looking out over the Texas desert where they had shared the survival exercise that had begun breaking down the barriers between them. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, reminding both men of countless nights spent in similar conversations in far more dangerous locations around the world. "I want to show you something," Davies said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small object that glinted in the starlight, a military decoration that Jake immediately recognized as the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest awards for gallantry in combat. "I received this for the mission where you extracted my team," Davies explained. "The citation mentions unknown American forces who provided critical support under hostile fire. I never knew who to thank until this week." Jake was genuinely moved by the revelation. He had participated in hundreds of missions during his military career, but few had resulted in such clear recognition of their successful outcome. Knowing that his actions had directly contributed to Davies receiving such significant recognition created a personal connection to that long-ago night in Afghanistan that he hadn't previously understood. "We were just doing our job," Jake replied, but Davies shook his head. "You saved 4 lives that night, including mine. The mission intelligence we gathered prevented terrorist attacks that could have killed dozens of civilians. Your courage, under fire, made a real difference in ways you probably never knew." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories from their respective military careers and discussing the challenges of transitioning from active combat roles to different forms of service. Davies described the psychological adjustment required to move from special operations to ceremonial duties, while Jake explained his own transition from frontline leadership to training responsibilities. As the sun began rising over the Texas horizon, both men acknowledged that their chance meeting during these exercises had provided something neither had expected to find. For Jake, it was confirmation that his combat service had made meaningful differences in specific, identifiable ways. For Davies, it was the opportunity to be recognized for his true military accomplishments rather than just his current ceremonial role. "I have a confession," Davies said as they prepared to part ways. "When I first saw you during the opening briefing, something seemed familiar. I couldn't place it, but I had the feeling we'd met before. Now I understand why." Jake smiled, remembering his own sense of recognition that had driven his curiosity about Davies throughout the exercises. Sometimes the universe has ways of bringing people together when they need to connect. We both needed this conversation, even if we didn't realize it initially. The formal farewell ceremony later that morning was bittersweet for Jake. He had arrived at the joint exercises expecting to observe routine training between American forces and ceremonial British soldiers. Instead, he was leaving with renewed appreciation for the lasting bonds created by shared combat experience and the unexpected ways those connections could resurface years later. Davies approached him just before the British contingent departed for their return flight to England. "Thank you, Commander, for everything. The recognition, the conversation, the opportunity to share my real experience with your soldiers. It's meant more than you probably realize." They shook hands one final time, and Jake noticed that Davies' grip was firm and confident rather than the carefully diplomatic handshake he had offered during their first meeting. The transformation was complete. The mysterious Royal Guard sergeant had become a respected colleague, and, Jake hoped, a lifelong friend. As the British soldiers loaded onto their transport vehicles, Jake reflected on how the 3-week exercise had exceeded everyone's expectations. Professional development had occurred, cultural barriers had been broken down, and genuine friendships had been formed. Most significantly, two combat veterans had found closure and recognition for shared experiences that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Standing on the base's flight line as the British aircraft taxied for departure, Jake raised his hand in farewell salute. Through the aircraft window, he could see Davies returning the gesture with military precision that now carried personal meaning rather than just professional courtesy. The circle that had begun on a desperate night in Afghanistan 8 years earlier was finally complete, bringing understanding and recognition that both men had needed without realizing it. The joint exercises were officially concluded, but Jake knew that the connections formed during these 3 weeks would continue, influencing both American and British military personnel for years to come. Sometimes the most valuable outcomes from military training had nothing to do with tactics or procedures. They came from human connections that reminded professional soldiers why their service mattered and how their sacrifices had made lasting differences in ways they might never fully understand.